Welcome to mobile app development with Ionic, React Native, and JHipster. You might be asking yourself, what is JHipster? Well, JHipster started as a very different project than it is today. It started as basically an AngularJS and Spring backend generator. So it generated an AngularJS front end, a Spring backend. And when I say, you notice I'm not saying Spring Boot, that's because we actually migrated from Spring to Spring Boot after Spring Boot was released. And so the first commit of the project was in December 7th, 2013, and the message was a hipster stack for Java developers. It was built with Yeoman, Spring, AngularJS, and one handy generator. And so Spring Boot wasn't even out yet, right? Spring Boot 1.0 came out in April 1st of 2014. So since then, it's grown quite a bit. Now it not only generates, an Angular front end, but it'll generate a React or a Vue front end. And on the back end, there's Spring Boot, of course, but you can also do microservices. You can also generate a Quarkus backend or a Micronaut backend. And if you're not a Java person, there's even support for Node.js with Nest.js and .NET Core backend. I think one of the problems is we don't have like a TCK or a spec to verify that those backends implement everything that the Spring Boot and Spring Cloud one does. But people are committing to those projects, and it's grown so much that we had almost 2 million downloads in 2020. So it's a very thriving open source project. And that's how it started. So to use JHipster, you can use the command line and do an npm install of generator JHipster. The reason we have that generator prefix is because that was a convention from Yeoman. And if you look up Yeoman and look at its generators, JHipster is like by far #1 over the years. And then you can create a new directory and CD into it. So if you're a Java developer, you're probably used to, creating an app and it creates a directory for you. Yeoman doesn't work that way. So the biggest mistake that I often make with JHipster is I won't create the directory and I won't CD into it. And therefore, I litter like my home directory with all these dot files. So try not to do that. And then you just run it. And once you run it, it will give you a number of options. You can see those here. It asks what type of application you have. It asks if you want to, use Webflux because we support Spring MVC and Spring Webflux. And then it asks for package names, what kind of database you want to use, if you want to use NoSQL or SQL, and all of those different options. And, oh wait, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity, no running water. I did have to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, but in the winter it snowed, and that was much better. I think I do have 10,000 hours of cross-country skiing in, so that's pretty fun. And the cabin on the left is the one I was born in, and the cabin on the right is my dad's sauna business. He started a sauna business, and he sold one to himself. No one else would buy them, so. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and 2 awesome kids, Abby and Jack. You can tell this picture is a bit dated since Jack's the tallest one in the family now. He's 17, and Abby's off to college up at CU. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe, short for Hefeweizen. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and he looks like this now. It took 12 years to make him look like that. He's got a Porsche engine, a Porsche transmission, and he really gets up and goes. You could also call him a very expensive obsession. If you like classic Volkswagens, I'd love to talk to you about them after. I work for Okta, and we do users as a software service. That acronym isn't great though, right? That's UAS. So I just like to say, user management as a software service. Funny thing is, for the first 2 years I worked at Okta, my dad called it Okra, and now he's graduated to Okta. He still can't get Okta, but he's got Okta down. And it's interesting, the name actually means a unit of cloud measurement from meteorological terms. So if it's an 8 octa day, it means it's very cloudy. If it's 0 octas, it means it's very sunny. So in Denver, we get a lot of 0 octa days. So now since we have a crowd and we're in person and it's fun to see people, it's one of the first times I have a presentation where I can ask questions to the audience. When you're on Zoom, you can't really ask questions to the audience, right? It doesn't work that way. So how many of you have used JHipster before? Okay, we got one, Dennis. Dennis is a friend of mine, in case you didn't know, because he actually was a tech editor on a JHipster book I wrote, so he's very well versed in JHipster. How many are using React? What about Angular? A few of you. And Vue? Got one in the back. What about Ionic? Nobody? Okay, React Native? We got one. Any Flutter fans? or using Flutter? Nope, okay. Anyone doing Java development? Java developers? Got a few of you. What about .NET? We got one. Node? A couple of you. Python? No? Okay. And then anyone prefer JavaScript over TypeScript? TypeScript over JavaScript? We got a couple. All right. So you can tell the Java developers in the room, right? They're the ones that always prefer TypeScript over JavaScript. And the JavaScript people are like, I like PHP too. All right. So that's my experience anyway. So the agenda for today, we got 40, 50, 60 minutes, depending on where we are on the clock here. I'm going to do a bit of comparison on the mobile web frameworks. I also like to put pretty graphs in my slide, whether those mean anything or not. That's up to you. And then we'll talk a bit about JHipster, talk a bit about the mobile framework options for a JHipster app, and then I'll do some demos in action. And I did restructure this presentation and updated it a lot. And everything that I'm going to talk about today is open source, and all the demos I show you are available, on GitHub. And I will let you know that as a result of producing this presentation and making sure all the demos work, I only logged 5 bugs with various projects. So that's the beauty of conference-driven development, is you tend to find issues with open source projects. So in part one, we're going to do comparing mobile frameworks, talk a bit about progressive web apps, hybrid apps, and native apps. So progressive web apps, if you haven't heard of them, it's basically taking a single page application and doing some things to it that make it so it can do offline mode and basically work like a native app. So it has to originate from a secure origin. That's requirement number one. So it has to be over HTTPS, otherwise you will never get a prompt to install it. It has to load while offline. This means that you could actually pull up the app and not have to log in right away to do anything. And what I've seen here is sometimes you will just cache that login request using PWA's features. And so, as long as you logged in once, you should be able to pull up that app and have that login retained. And then it references a web app manifest. And that web app manifest has things like colors, icons, URLs to load, and things of that sort. And so they can be installed on a mobile device, and they look and act like a native application, and they're distributed through the web. And one thing I forgot from this previous slide is PWAs are basically the web's response to mobile apps that are really big. In a lot of parts of the world, you actually can't, download Facebook on your phone because your phone doesn't even have that much memory, right? And so what Google and Facebook figured out, because they want to reach everyone, right, all of India, all of Africa, is that if we can make these web apps that act like mobile apps, then people don't really need to install them so much. And if they do install them, it's a very small footprint versus the mobile app. So from a quote from Alex Russell in October 2016, so this is 5 years ago at Chrome Summit, he reported that 3 seconds on a 3G connection is realistic for people to load a website and actually interact with it, right? That's what they want. And at that same time in that year, DoubleClick reported that 53% of visits are abandoned if a mobile site takes more than 3 seconds. And the same report said the average time for a mobile site to load is 19 seconds. So you can see why people, wanted PWAs. In 2018, that actually increased to 22 seconds. So it's getting worse, right? Not better. And, half of your users will leave after 3 seconds. That's a terrible experience. So now that the majority of web users are mobile, devs on wicked fast laptops don't feel the pain of their users, and our laptops are often just filthy liars, right? And so when you see people take, and talk about mobile first development, what they actually mean is that even though you might develop it on your laptop, whenever you run it, you're actually running it on a device and you're running it with the 3G connection. And if you do that, you'll see some pain and you'll be like, wow, we really need to optimize things, right? Versus running it on a fast connection. And so, progressive web apps typically are very fast because they just have an app shell and then they load the data after, and they use a service worker which runs in the background, or it's almost like a proxy. You can think of it as a proxy for a web app, and it can cache the results. So because of that, it can run very fast, and it shouldn't, if you toggle off the internet, you should still be able to use that app. And so JHipster has the ability to enable a PWA. So if you're using React or Vue, there is this code in an index.html file, and you just have to go uncomment it, basically, and then it registers that service worker It already has the web app manifest, and then of course you'll have to configure HTTPS, but those are the 3 ingredients. If you're using Angular, it's enabled by default when you run JHipster in a prod mode. And so there's many hybrid app frameworks, and hybrid app frameworks are typically, you author them with web technologies, but then it looks like a native app on the device. You deploy it to a device. The difference with hybrid app frameworks is many of them support actually running in a browser as well. And Ionic was one of the first ones that supported, browser and device. React Native actually took a while, but now they support actually web as well. Flutter, I'm not sure, and then Xamarin and NodeScript are the other 2 logos in there. And isn't it interesting that all of them are a shade of blue? Like, did someone do a study and say, if we're going to do a hybrid app framework, we got to make sure and have a blue logo? I don't know. So as far as native app frameworks, there's typically not like frameworks in this space, and if there is, I haven't dabbled in it enough to know what they actually are. But these are logos for Swift, right? Kotlin, Gluon for Java FX, and then Java up there as an Android, thing as well. And so these, if you're going to write like a game or something like that, you'll probably use one of these frameworks, and you'll just get, down and dirty. It's more of a language than a framework, right? And you'll actually write that native code that talks to the device, and you don't have any intermediary layer there. And so I promised you some pretty graphs. If we look at Stack Overflow tags, most people have issues with React, right? And then few people have issues. The next most is Angular. And it's funny, I don't think this is people most have the issues with these particular frameworks. I just think that they are the most popular, right? So there's a lot of people posting questions about React because that community is huge. Angular is the same way. And in the past, I used to compare Java web frameworks. And I remember back in like 2004 when the Wicket folks were like, the reason that Struts has so much mailing list traffic is because people have the hardest time using it, right? And 2 years later, I was doing the same talk, but updated stats and everything. And I was like, well, Wicket has the most mailing list traffic now. Does that mean most people have a problem with Wicket? And they're like, no, our community is just really thriving, right? So I do think Stack Overflow tags are the modern, mailing list traffic thing, and I do think it's just a representation of the community. So if you look at this, it looks like Ionic has actually had the least amount of questions on Stack Overflow. That was kind of surprising to me. But over the last week or so, I've been doing some tweets about Ionic and reading some other people's tweets, and I think because of recent changes they made, and because they're allowing React and Vue now as well, they've actually made it so you're not really developing Ionic apps. You're just developing Angular apps, or you're just developing React apps, and then you're adding Capacitor to put it on a mobile device, right? So I would say that most people developing Ionic might not think of it as Ionic. They might think of it as, I'm using Ionic components, but I'm not actually developing an Ionic app. I'm just developing an Angular app. So that's the only reason I can think there. I do see a ton of people, like just on the interwebs in general, talking about Flutter and asking about Flutter. So that one is getting more popular. I don't know where it's coming from. It doesn't seem like a US central thing, but again, Google's pushing it, right? So there's a lot of power behind their brand and getting people to use stuff. And then if you look at jobs, there's the most jobs for React. There's a lot for Angular as well. And then Ionic, people really aren't hiring for that because I think they're hiring for Angular, React, or Vue. And then React Native has a fair amount, but nothing compared to React. And then there's this other framework site that's kind of fun, hotframeworks.com, and it shows the top 10 frameworks based on GitHub score, and that means a star rating, right, on GitHub as well as a Stack Overflow score. And they have React at number 1, they have Angular at number 3, Ruby on Rails is in there at number 4, ASP.NET is number 2, and then AngularJS is in there at 5, which is still like, whoa, people are still developing apps or maybe maintaining them, who knows. And then, Spring is down there at number 10. Vue is number 6. And so if you were to go to this site, the reason I'm able to decipher it, because this doesn't make a lot of sense, this graph, is there's a table below that where they actually list them out, right? The top 25 or whatnot. And before this conference last week, I decided to do a poll. And as you probably know, Twitter polls are very biased, right? It's who was ever following me. If I've been talking about Ionic for the past couple of years, then I probably have Ionic followers, more so than React followers or React Native. So this is a poll that I did, and I got responses from the Ionic folks that said this actually matches what they see as well with their install base and their users. So most people that are using Ionic are doing Angular apps. And then this is very interesting because you'll notice here I have 1,900 votes on this one. And the next one where I'm asking for native frameworks, I only got like 327. So I think that's, again, my follower bias, where most people that follow me are web developers, not so much native developers, right? So again, Ionic very popular, but that's probably skewed, right? If one of the React Native developers did the same poll, he would probably have React Native at 80%, you know? And so who wants to learn how to do mobile app development? All right, we got a yes. That's one of the key things you're supposed to do in a presentation, is get the audience to say yes. So here we go. I'm going to talk a bit about JHipster, and then we'll go and show some demos, and I'll show you how to install and use it, as well as authentication with OpenID Connect, and we'll talk a bit about the code quality out of the box. So JHipster has a number of goals. It wants to be a high-performance and robust server-side stack with excellent code test coverage. It wants to use Bootstrap on the front end, so when people ask us, hey, can you use Angular material instead of Bootstrap? We're like, well, then you got to figure out how to do it with React and Vue, because we're trying to be unified across all of those frameworks. And then a powerful workflow to build your app with Webpack and Maven or Gradle. So we use Spring Boot's dev tools. So if you actually save a file and recompile it, it'll actually restart the server. You don't have to do anything. And on the front end, we use browser sync to, you know, refresh the browser if you make any changes on the front end files. Then it's got, you know, a resilient microservices architecture with cloud native principles in mind. You can tell that maybe someone like me wrote these and tried to use some marketing terms, right? I got cloud native in there. And then the last goal that doesn't fit on the slide is infrastructure as code, so you can quickly deploy to the cloud. So I already showed you this slide about how to install JHipster. There's also JHipster online, so if you go to start.jhipster.tech, it's similar to start.spring.io. You can actually go through and just choose the options from a dropdown, and then you can download the project, or you can push it to like GitHub or GitLab. This is what it looks like. You can see it's it's just a web page that's got all the choices in there. And then we also have something really cool or really hip, because we're hipsters, right? The JHipster domain language. So that's how we know we're hip, because we have our own domain language. But it basically allows you to define not only an application, but your entities and the relationships between them. There's no relationship information on this one because, you know, if I put it on there, then the font would be really small and you couldn't see it. But this is an application definition on the left, and then, you know, a photo gallery entities on the right there. And so the demo that I will eventually show you, I will create an app with JHipster. I'll generate entities for that app so we can, you know, CRUD those entities. And then I'll convert the app to be a PWA and test with Lighthouse. And one of the things I've learned is npm install on stage is very boring, very slow, and very error prone. So what I'm going to do today is actually just run things. I'm not going to create anything, but I will show you how I created it all so you can take that home and try it yourself if you want. So the demo I'm going to show you today for JHipster is I tried to capitalize on the keywords full stack Java. So if I was to, you know, take my tech editor's advice on this post, he would say build a photo gallery instead of full stack Java, but I was like, I want those SEO keywords, right? So this is basically a blog post that I wrote for the Auth0 blog that shows you how to build, you know, a photo gallery using React and Spring Boot, and, you know, does it all in the back end. And what I wanted to follow it up with is how to create Ionic clients for that, or React Native clients. So that's what I've done over the past week for this talk, is created those, and then those will eventually become a blog post after I fix all the bugs that I entered, you know, from this last week. So JHipster's code quality is pretty darn good out of the gate. So you can see down there at the bottom there, we have 65.6% test coverage on all of the different, you know, code in the project. So that includes not only Java code, but it also includes the TypeScript code for the front end. In this case, it's doing React. And I should let you know that we also have Kotlin support on the back end. So if you did want to use Spring Boot with Kotlin, there is a Kotlin generator for Spring Boot, and you can use that instead of the Java version. And so in this example, what I did is I just took that app and I ran Docker for Sonar, because we put that in your project by default, started that up, and then ran this big long command that basically runs all the tests and then publishes to Sonar when they're done. And then I also did some testing on Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a tool that's in Chrome. So if you pull up Chrome and you look at Chrome Developer Tools, there's a Lighthouse tab in there, and you can actually test your project. And you'll see here it does pretty well. 86 on the performance isn't awesome, right? You would like that to be in the 90s because that's obviously better. Best practice is 87, both of those are okay. And it's just, it takes a little bit to load. You can see the first contentful paint there is about 1.1 seconds. And ideally you want that, under a second. And, but it doesn't do too bad. And then on the right there, you'll see that it's progressive web app. It's got like an indicator that's supposed to say that it is a progressive web app that satisfies those three things. It used to be a score there as well, but they changed it just to be like, yes, it actually is. And so I also found a new tool that works pretty well, webdev.measure. You can actually run a Lighthouse report on any site that's publicly on the internet. So I took this app and I deployed it to Heroku, and then I ran, flickr-2.heroku.app in there. And I think the most interesting thing about this is most of the numbers are the same, right, except for that performance. So if you're running on a laptop and running Lighthouse, that's way different than running on an actual website, right? So keep that in mind, that if you get really good scores on your laptop, put it in production and then see what your scores are like, because network latency is like the biggest problem with performance, right? And that's why you want to eventually put it onto a CDN or something like that. I do have this slide. Let's see. That's not pulling up there. I did some tests on some other sites I just wanted to bring up, and then I'll probably forget to do this a couple times, but mirroring versus unmirroring. All right, I gotta get my mouse. Where's my mouse at? There we go. And pull this over here, and then mirror so you can see it. Bump that up a little. So this is, there's that first one, right? The web.dev measure. You'll see it's even lower there, 59 on performance. But there's this webpage test.org that's pretty good as well. And you'll see JHipster scores really well on most of those except for the effective use of a CDN. So that's the likely reason we're getting a low score on the performance. Everything else is an A. Also securityheaders.com, if you haven't heard of that site, it tests for all your security headers. And you'll see we're getting an A there as well. So that's all pretty good. And if we were to go to that app, it's right here, it's running. If I were to click login, one of the things with Heroku is I haven't actually paid to keep it running. So when I click login right there, it's probably starting up Heroku in the back end. So we'll come back to this in a bit. So part 3 is Ionic. What is Ionic? Why? Talk about the Ionic module for JHipster. Let me just switch this back here. So Ionic's very interesting because, what happened there? They have a company that's called Ionic as well, right? And so it's always tough when you have a product that's the same name as your company. So if you're familiar with Ionic, now it's called Ionic Framework, but the company is still Ionic, so they had to tack framework on there to decipher them. But what I really like about the company itself is they've really embraced the web and tried to do new projects that are still very supportive of the web. So even though they have Ionic Framework, it's been around for a while. It was AngularJS based in the beginning, and then they added all the other frameworks. They also created this project called Stencil that allows you to just create web components, and it uses like TypeScript and annotations like flavor, and it looks very similar to like Angular code, but it generates these web components that can be used everywhere. And for the most part, like, most of us probably don't care about web components because we're using Angular, we're using React, and we just use those components. But if you're a company like Ionic, it makes a lot of sense to do everything as web components and then make it so each of those frameworks can consume them. And so they also created a PWA toolkit, which is just a GitHub repo that you can clone and get started with a PWA. And so you might be asking, why are you even interested in something like a mobile app when JHipster, creates PWAs for you? And basically, when I first wrote the JHipster book with like version 2 of JHipster, I found that it really the app experience on my phone was a website. It wasn't a PWA, but it was really terrible. There wasn't even Remember Me, right? So every time I would open the app, I would have to copy and paste like my username and password from 1Password, and it was just painful, right? It was at the point where I was like, fine, I'm just going to memorize my password so I can type it in each time. And then, I think version 4, they added Remember Me, so it got a little better, but still it never had like that crisp, app kind of feel. It still felt like a website. And so I wanted to develop the best user experience. So that's why I created Ionic for JHipster. But at the same time, it's funny to fast forward 5 years and look, there's still no 21 points in the App Store. So even though I created a framework to do what I wanted to do, I still haven't published like that app that I want to use. I still use 21 points on my phone all the time, but I don't use it with an app. And then how's a mobile app for JHipster, different from its Angular UI? I think the biggest difference is a mobile app is distributed in an app store, so it's searchable, right? People go to app stores and they search for stuff. Like on the web, you can't search for an app. You can search for something, but you don't really search for an app. So, it's basically a way of hitting all your bases, right? If you're going to have different clients in different places and you want to really grow your app, then, make sure you have a PWA on the web, but then distribute an app as well in the store. And so the Ionic module for JHipster currently depends on the Ionic CLI. So it invokes the Ionic CLI to create a new app and then overlays some files over that. It also uses Yeoman. So at one time, JHipster actually required Yo JHipster, which I thought was cool because it was like, yo, create me an app, right? But now you can just run JHipster. Well, with this one, you still need to type the Yo in front of it, and then it'll create an app for you. The cool part is it looks at your existing JHipster app and figures out what you need to do, and then you can import the entities from that as well. And so the demo I will show you at the end is, create an app with Ionic for J. That's what I like to call it because 4J is all over in Java land, right? Log4j and Neo4j and all that. Generate entities in the app, run it as a PWA because Ionic does support, starting it up in a browser, and that's a great development experience, and then we'll run it on iOS as well. And you can also refer to this old blog post I wrote in 2019. The good news is it was updated in 2021 on April 18th. I should also let you know that Ionic does have an auth Connect product for OpenID Connect. So what I'm going to show you today is using Ionic App Auth, and that's free. It's open source. Like some guy in England wrote it, and that works pretty well. The Auth Connect from Ionic does cost like $2,500 a month. It's part of bigger features than just the Auth Connect. But then the funny thing is if you're going to use like Okta or you're going to use Auth0 or something like that, you're going to have to pay for them as well, right? But Auth0 I think starts at free, and then for 100 or 200 more users, it's like $23 a month. So a lot different from $2,500, But everything I'm going to show you today is free and doesn't cost anything. And then on to React Native. So React Native lets you build mobile apps using only JavaScript. And I do believe they support TypeScript, but most of the apps that I've seen are JavaScript. And they aren't mobile web apps because React Native uses the same fundamental UI building blocks as regular iOS and Android apps. So they kind of compile down to the native components. And they also support Storybook for developing components in isolation, React Navigation, Redux, and Sagas. And so the JHipster React Native plugin, or it used to be a module, is now a blueprint. So if you've ever heard of React Native and Ignite, Ignite was a CLI for creating React Native apps. I believe it kind of lagged on maintenance, and so the guy who maintains this one rewrote it as a blueprint. And how blueprints work in JHipster is we allow you to use them to override the default behaviors. So that's how we have the Micronaut backend or the Quarkus backend or whatnot, is you install the blueprint and then you run it with it. You can see -- blueprints there. And then it'll create, the UI using React Native. For instance, we have a Svelte blueprint, right? That would create a Svelte front end instead of Angular. And then, you build the next hot mobile app. So John and I both have moved the Ionic and the React Native modules to the JHipster project. Before, Ionic was on Octadev's GitHub, and it was on his personal one. So we just did that in the last week in hopes of getting more contributors. We still plan on maintaining them a lot, but, getting more people to help. And so this is, very similar. We'll create an app with React Native. We'll generate entities, run it in a browser, run it on iOS. So how many people in the audience prefer to develop or prefer to use iOS? We got one. How many people prefer Android? Okay. So the rest of you are like, I don't care. Right? They both work. And I think it's different. Like, programming for one is probably different than using one, right? I think in my experience, like, iOS is typically easier to run the emulators locally, but you have to have a Mac, so that's only easy for Mac users. And then Android, like, you have to punch holes in the proxy and stuff like that to get it to even talk to localhost. So, it can be a little cumbersome there. So this is a demo that John did on using JHipster React Native. You can see it's got 3 different views there. There's an an iOS app, there's an Android one on the right, and then the web view in the middle. And the cool thing about this is it actually has built-in over-the-air updates using Expo, so that's a feature of React Native. And so you can actually push updates to your user, and when they launch the app, it'll download it, and then the next time they launch it, it'll have that update. So there's also Flutter, and like I said, I've heard a lot about Flutter, but I've rarely talked to any developers that are actually doing Flutter. And it is written in Dart, right, instead of JavaScript or instead of TypeScript. So I think it's Google's attempt to keep that language alive, right, because everything they did with it before hasn't really worked out. So choose to develop cross-platform apps for Android, iOS, Linux, Mac, Windows, Google Fuchsia, and the web from a single code base. So you can tell it's a Google product because they have Google Fuchsia in there, and I don't know, I've never developed for Google Fuchsia like personally, right? So it was first described in 2015, I think, as a concept, and then it was released in May of 2017. And this particular module for JHipster is missing a few features. It doesn't have Keycloak support, doesn't have OIDC support out of the box. It does have JWT support, and I've been trying to get that to work for like 4 months. And so I tried again today. There's an issue where I just keep posting my problems with it, and the guy keeps responding and being like, it works for me, but it doesn't always work. So the cool thing is you can try Flutter in your browser. So if you go to flutter.dev, you can actually run this code, and then on the right, it's got, the rendered version of the code. So I think that's pretty cool. And like React Native, Flutter uses reactive style views. However, React Native transpiles to native widgets, Flutter compiles all the way to native code. And so Flutter controls each pixel on the screen, which they say avoids performance problems caused by the need for a JavaScript bridge. I don't know if that's true, but this is again from Google's site that I'm downloading. So they say that Dart is an easy language to learn and offers the following features: open source, scalable programming language, object-oriented single inheritance language that uses a C-style syntax, transcompiles optionally into JavaScript, supports interfaces, abstract classes. None of those jump out as me as like, wow, Dart is so cool, right? But they put it on their website. So we do have a Flutter module for JHipster. This is not on the main JHipster site, and personally, I think it's just because there's open issues, and the person that's maintaining it, it's working well for him, but other people are struggling to get it to work, right? And so you can install it using that command there at the top, and then you run yo JHipster Flutter Merlin, and then you should be able to build a beautiful app. But like I said, I haven't been able to make it work. The biggest thing that I've seen the difference between this one and the Ionic and React Native ones is this one will create the app inside your JHipster app. So you've already created your JHipster app, you CD into it, you run that command, it creates a new directory with your Flutter app in it. The other ones expect you to create it outside, right, to be in a separate repo or whatnot, which I think is more sane, but I can see the beauty of this one as well. And so the guy did write a tutorial on it, and there's a screenshot, so he got it running at least. I think one of the biggest problems we see with JHipster is it has major releases every year or two, and so he wrote this and spent a lot of time on it for JHipster 6. We released JHipster 7 at the beginning of the year, and he just hasn't updated it for that. But still, the JHipster API on the back end is just endpoints. Shouldn't be that different, right? So who knows? So now I would like to do some demos, and we got, 15 minutes left, so hopefully these all work here. And I got to remember to mirror my screen, or you guys will be like, he keeps talking, but he's not showing anything. And then the number one rule when you do bump your screen is make sure and bump the fonts, or no one will be able to read it, right? So we'll try 720. Searching. I tried it earlier and it worked. I was thinking, there we go. All right, so that's pretty big. You in the back can read it? So far, anyway. All right, so I have everything for this at github.com, Raible, JHipster, mobile JHipster. So I think even if you just Google for mobile JHipster, you'll find this. And I can close the other tabs. And then I created this demo script. So everything in here is the working result of everything. And then I wrote an ASCII doc, and I have a nice ASCII Doctor plugin there. So we start by building a photo gallery with JHipster. There's some prereqs, the Java 11 and Node 14. So you create a new directory to hold the projects, right? Because you're going to have a back end, you're going to have two front ends, the Ionic and React Native. And in this example, I just cloned the backend, right? So instead of creating a whole new app, I think it's easier to clone one that I know works. And because this first project was created as a standalone Git repository, I did have to remove Git and remove Husky because, you know, it's in now like a mono repo kind of thing. And then start up Keycloak and start up MVN. So let's see if Keycloak is running. Docker PS, looks like it is. I don't need Postgres running, so I'll shut that down. JH Postgres down. Oh, it doesn't even have it in there. Oh, we're in the wrong directory. So mobile JHipster. And that's just a shortcut I have. Oh, we're not in the right directory. So you can see I'm a little rusty on my demos, right? I'm used to doing them virtually. There we go. Okay, Docker PS. Now we just have that one, so now we can start it up. We have Keycloak running already, and this is basically, you know, just building everything. I did build it once. If you're creating a brand new project, the npm install takes like 2 minutes to create the project. If you're doing this for the first time, it actually does it again, and so it will take a little longer, but you notice here it started right up, so it already did that npm install, which is usually the painful part. So if I were to log in here, and click sign in, it'll redirect me to Keycloak, which is running locally on 9080. Don't save it, and then we have some entities here, right? We have albums, photos, tags on photos. This is my Flickr clone, so I'm just gonna add, you know, a photo or two here. So this was a golf date night with my wife a few months ago. Save that one. And the images are kind of big, so that's why it, you know, takes a little longer than you would expect. And the other thing, this is kind of cool, I just learned this. So whatever image component we're using allows you to like drag and drop right on it. So that's cool. This is my parents' porch, Montana porch. And so it's cool that like JHipster supports like images and saving them out of the box. This is a photo gallery like component that I had from React that, you know, I didn't have to do much with, but integrate it. And this is just fall picture. So we have some pictures in there now. It should render them all. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll open up Ionic. So let's go back to the instructions and make sure I'm not skipping anything here. I think we had them in Chrome. Oh, and there's a lightbox feature in here too, right? So if you click on that, I have noticed there's a little lag, and I don't know if it's the photo gallery component itself, but you notice I clicked there and it took like 2 seconds to load it up. But this is like a lightbox component, right, that kind of shows the text and everything, so that's kind of neat. For Ionic, you just need to install, you know, all these different dependencies. Yo, JHipster Ionic. So I created a new directory, or actually this creates a directory for you, so you don't need to create the directory. And then I just renamed it to Ionic, and then you can launch it with Ionic Serve. And then I use JDL for that JHipster app, so this is me importing that JDL for the Ionic app. And then I did some logic because I had metadata in these photos that I wanted to process and display, but I didn't want the user to put those in because they don't know the height, the width, and all that kind of thing. So if you're creating a new record, I just hide those. And then I did have to do some custom logic for iOS, so it basically, when you go to Keycloak and come back, it launches the app again. And then I did have to configure some core settings on the JHipster app to allow capacitor localhost as an origin. And then this is how you run it in simulator. So we'll start with Ionic Serve. And so this will just run it in a browser, and once we've seen it run in a browser, then I'll go ahead and run it, you know, in iOS simulator. And Angular 13, right, just came out last week. It's supposed to be a lot better about the compilation phase. You notice that took, you know, a little longer than expected if it was already compiled by me earlier, so that was kind of weird. But they, you know, do think they will get better. So you'll notice there it actually logged me in right away, right, because I was already logged into the JHipster app. So if I were to go to a new private window and then click sign in, it would redirect me to Keycloak. Now I'm in the JHipster app. And, you know, I could look at photos, and then it pulls them in. So I probably need to do a little more work so it doesn't display no photos found if it actually knows there's some in there, right? But the cool thing is, you know, you could go into either one of these and, like, look at them. You could even, you know, delete one if you wanted. and that'll go back to the server and delete it. So there's only, 4 now, and you could also, add a new one if you wanted. Let's see what that looks. I mean, one of the ways you can do it, right, is you can, it's not so much I don't know how to do it in Firefox, but Chrome, you can go here, then open up tools, and you can do like this, right? So it looks like it is a phone, and then you can change it to, iPhone X or something like that. So you can see how it looks on all the different phone devices, which is pretty nice. But here you can do Ionic, or actually it's MPX cap run iOS. And so what I've learned is you do have to do a build first. I already did the build, so it shouldn't be an issue, but you have to run Ionic build to build the files, and then you run that command to actually run it on, an emulator. And if you don't, what you'll find is basically you change your code, you run it on the emulator, you don't see your changes there, so you do have to do the build like each time. But there is a way that you can tell it to refresh all the time, which is pretty slick, right? You want that experience where you modify code and the iOS, like even in the simulator, it refreshes itself. The only thing I've seen is it uses an external IP, it doesn't use localhost, and so you do have to go into your JHipster app and say like, allow this IP for cores, right? And so that's the only issue I've seen there. But yeah, it's frustrating otherwise, right? To actually have to relaunch and wait all this time for the simulator to relaunch, but at the same time, it motivates you with Ionic to not deploy onto your device until you're done, right? You make it all work in your browser, but then if you want like a camera feature, right, you're not going to get that in your browser, you're going to get that on the device. And you might even have to deploy it to your real device to see if it actually works, with an actual camera. Because one of the features that I added to this plugin is if you do have images like you have there and you do add image, it'll prompt you on the phone, on the device, if you want to take an image or upload one from your catalog, right? And so that's a pretty slick feature, but good luck testing it in the simulator. So now once we're here, we can click sign in. Oh, client ID not found. Oh, this was the thing. So Ionic build was exactly the problem I was talking about. So the last time I built this, I used like Okta or I used Auth0, and so that was the client ID it was sending to that. So we'll come back to this one. Let me, as soon as this is done building, I'll restart it. But we can do the React Native one in the meantime. So React Native, and then this one's just npm start. We'll run that one on iOS. And so this one's a bit different. It actually opens up a web page, right? And then it says, what do you want to do? Do you want to run it in a web browser? And so you can say, yep. And then it'll start it up in a browser. And you have to add this to JHipster, right? So it knows that it's coming from that origin for cores. And then once you're there, you can click login. It'll take you to Keycloak to log in. And then you can see your entities and your photos. So pretty slick, and obviously it's just boilerplate, right? Once you generate it, you want to make it look better from there. And then this one's still going back here, so we'll just stop that one. And I wanted to make sure we got this one going. And then I'll start this one, and then we'll do an iOS one right after it. And so the cool thing is down here you can also press, right, Android, I, or web and open them there too. This one should be back here. It should be using Keycloak now, right? And so we can log in. You can see it, and then you can see the entities. Go to photos, and it'll pull them all in from the JHipster backend. And then this one here we can do I to open it up on iOS. And this React Native actually does have the hot reloading by default. And so depending on which emulator you're in, you just have to like hit a key or two and it'll hot reload it for you. So it does a much better job of that. But Ionic did add it recently, so it's pretty slick there too. And they both have end-to-end tests, so it uses Detox for React Native. That's one of their frameworks for doing end-to-end tests. For Ionic, we're still using Protractor. Obviously, we probably need to revert to Cypress. But the cool thing is the backend for JHipster is also using Cypress. So if you were to run npm run e2e, it would actually start up Cypress and test all the front end. So even though you generated CRUD for all those entities, there's also tests for all those entities CRUD, and you can verify like your whole app works and all the login and authentication works, right? So it's a pretty cool way to, like, even if you're not using JHipster, you can generate an app with it and see how we implemented Cypress and be like, okay, I can use this in my project, right? It's all Apache 2 licensed, so free to use and make it work that way. And probably the last thing I wanted to show is just the actual implementation. I won't have time to demo it because we only have a few minutes left, but I did add for Okta and Auth0. So I'm just going to stop this here because that's taken a little while. But if we were to use Auth0, I did have to make a few changes. So the biggest one is on the back end. They have an email claim that is actually not an email, so I had to do some logic for that. And then there's this user service, because what we do in JHipster is we take the user once they've logged in and we put it in a user table in the database. And the reason we do that is so you can have relationships to that user, right? And it's a lot of just how JPA works in the Spring Boot backend. And so I just added some tests for that. And then on the front end, all I had to do is change this to be a client ID from an app that I created on Auth0. With Keycloak, we basically made the app kind of wide open by default, and so you can pretty much do everything, but native apps require PXE authentication, proof key for code exchange with auth code flow in a mobile browser or in a browser itself, and so that's why I had to change that. And then I also had to pass in the audience. So how Auth0 works, and I just learned this in the last week, is if you don't pass in an audience when you're creating an authorization request, you actually get back what's called an opaque access token, and it's just a random string of characters. And you could say a JWT is also a random string of characters, and you'd be right. But a JWT you can decode, and it has like claims in there that you can see and do stuff with. And so if you don't pass in the audience, you don't get a JWT. And so with these apps, or this Ionic one and the React Native, JHipster expects that you'll be passing a JWT in. And so it acts as a stateless resource server in this instance when you're using a mobile app. Like if you're actually using the PWA that ships with JHipster, it's not stateless, right? It stores everything in session, but when you're talking to these from mobile apps, it is stateless. So there's just those tweaks there, and then passing in the audience there. And then for React Native, we had to specify that client ID as well. And then this was weird. I actually had the issuer that comes back from Auth0, or the default issuer, is a trailing slash, and you need that or it won't work. But all the frameworks expect you not to have a slash. So all the OIDC frameworks I've used with Auth0, I have to go in and trim off the issuer whenever I use that, after the initial call. So that's what these are doing. And then I had to change the audience there, but not bad. Just passing in an audience and trimming the issuer. And then for Okta, it was a little easier, but I've also been doing the Okta thing for a lot longer. So this is we just had to change the client ID. And then this one, I just figured why not pass in the audience, because Okta will support that as well. It wouldn't change anything. The default one is API://default. So, like all I really need to do is change the client ID for Okta, right? Because I created a native app or whatnot. So what's next for JHipster? We're looking at Spring Native. Josh Long and I got this working about 2 months ago, end of September, so only a month ago. And Spring Native uses GraalVM to compile the JHipster app to a native binary, and it starts in like a second instead of like 10 or 15 seconds. So if you have a much smaller app, you can do it in milliseconds, right? If you're doing Quarkus or Micronaut, you might even get down to 20 milliseconds, which is usable in a serverless environment, right? So that can be very cost savings for big companies that are spending millions of dollars a month, right, on AWS. Like they can drop their bill in half if they're using serverless. Micro front ends, we do have support for micro front ends with JHipster for Angular, and I believe it's almost there for Vue. And so what micro front ends are is if you generate a microservice architecture with JHipster, maybe you have a store that's over here, maybe you have a blog that's over here, and then you have a gateway that forwards all your requests to them. By default, what JHipster does is it generates a monolith UI on the gateway. And so microservices, the whole point is they're independently deployable. But if your UI is a monolith, then they're not really independently deployable because you have to update the store UI as you update the store microservice, right? So what micro front ends allow you to do is the UI actually sits on that microservice, and then the gateway pulls them in. So there's Webpack has this thing called module federation that allows you to do that. And so what it does is it remotely loads, those things at runtime. It works pretty slick, and so we do have that option now for Angular, and we will have it for Vue. And GraphQL, I think, is something that would be cool to have in JHipster. And I also think it's cool that Spring Boot basically and Spring Data said we don't need GraphQL until like 6 months ago, when they were like, oh yeah, we're gonna add it. And so they're adding support for it now too. And that's like changed their whole perspective of GraphQL, right? They're like, no, it's great. Before they were like, you don't need that, right? So, but I should also note that these are my personal interests, right? These are what I would like to see. That doesn't mean that it's actually what the project will do. The unique thing that we have with JHipster is we use Open Collective to collect donations, and Okta is like a platinum sponsor of the project, and so we have over $100,000 a year now for open source development on the project, and we pay people to do things like this, right? So I can hire someone and say, hey, will you implement GraphQL for us? Pay them 20 grand to do it or whatnot. And the cool thing is if you actually work on JHipster, I've heard that they do buy you like new M1 laptops if you're a frequent contributor. So I haven't gotten one myself, but my company will buy me one. So my action for you today is try JHipster if you haven't. If you're looking for some of the concepts like React with Bootstrap 5, there's a PR out there that just got merged today that does that. So if you're wanting to learn how to do that, that's there. Learn more about PWAs because they're certainly cool, and if you're doing any sort of SPA, you should be able to add PWA capabilities to it. Check out Ionic for JHipster and React Native for JHipster, and report issues. That's all I've been doing for the last few days because it was like, why doesn't this work? And so the road ahead in the future is certainly more PWAs, more mobile apps. So this is a way to get started on those, and JHipster makes it pretty easy by generating it. So you learn that JHipster is a cool project. It's got all these mobile apps, and it works with Okta. So if you liked what I showed you today, we post similar tutorials on our blog all the time at developer.okta.com/blog, and that Oktadev Twitter handle is everywhere. We have it on GitHub. We have it on, I don't think it works on LinkedIn, but it works on GitHub and Twitter and Twitch. So follow us if you're interested. And all of the source is on GitHub in my mobile JHipster repo, and I'll keep updating that every few months, and when all these bugs are fixed, I'll fix those as well. And I think if you view source on that demo.adoc, it actually has like links to the GitHub issues I logged. And so thanks for coming today, especially the last presentation of the conference. You can find me on my blog at raibledesigns.com, find me on Twitter. I've already uploaded this presentation to Speaker Deck, so if you go there, it should be available now. And then I put a lot of code on GitHub. So thank you, and may the auth be with you.